Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second in our new series of online Llafur events. I'm really glad to have been able to join us today. My name is Ian Rees, and I'm chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Hopefully, a number of you were able to join us for last week's event on memorialisation and Welsh history. Our topic this week, Wales and opposition to apartheid, falls under the same broad theme of the history of race relations in Wales, prompted of course by the recent Black Lives Matter protests. As well as discussing various aspects of this issue over this series of events, Llafur is also seeking to be proactive in finding ways to help tackle racial discrimination in Welsh society. To this end, you may be interested to know that the Society recently sent a joint letter to the First Minister in conjunction with the Heritage and Cultural Exchange and the Paul Robeson Wales Trust. And we've recently received a reply from Mark Drakeford thanking us for our support and confirming that Gaynor Legall, who I'm delighted to say is one of our panellists today, has agreed to chair a task and finish group for the Welsh Government, which will undertake a review of all statues, monuments, building names and road signs in Wales. It's hoped that this will enable us to look properly at our past and the links between Wales and the slave trade. We're going to kick off today's event with a short BBC Wales film, which will hopefully help contextualise the ensuing discussions. The film details the anti-apartheid protests of 1969 and 1970 in Swansea against the SPRINGBOKS rugby tour, which were a flashpoint for the wider anti-apartheid movement already underway in Wales. Just to say, before we show the film, we've had permission from BBC Wales to show this video on condition that we stream it directly from their website. So apologies if there's any distortion. We will share the link afterwards. James, over to you.
Not play for the Springboks unless you were white, against the laws of the land, against the old apartheid system. We were determined to disrupt this rugby tour as much as we could, every one of the 25 matches, both to stop them touring again, but more important, to stop the cricket tour coming the following year in 1970. We stopped the match by a physical interruption. We weren't fighting anybody. The fight started from the police, and particularly the rugby vigilantes, to whom the police threw the demonstrators once they dragged them off the pitch. With the exception of John Taylor, the Welsh forward international, who refused to play against the Springboks, frankly, it was a dialogue of the deaf between anti-apartheid protesters like me, the players and the spectators. They thought we were just interfering with their game, and we were really angry about it. We were trying to argue with them to say, you are collaborators with the most evil racist system in the world. When I discovered that my friends had had a jaw broken, a woman demonstrator nearly lost an eye, I mean, the viciousness and the violence of the rugby stewards, vigilantes, call them what you like, was really incredible. And it caused such waves that in London, the Home Secretary, then James Callaghan, Cardiff MP, got the police chiefs in and said this can't happen again. And for the rest of the tour, you never saw quite that scale. None of the other matches were anything like it.
I said, I don't think it's going to be that easy. We've never had to cope with demonstrations. The country's never seen those kind of demonstrations in rugby or against it in sport within the country. So I think it's going to be a very tough tour.
It was a worldwide campaign, which began as an economic boycott and then broadened into a sports boycott and a cultural boycott. It was very much a student demonstration, seemingly. It was a broad public campaign, a broad demonstration, but it was essentially perceived of because of the violence. The violence meted upon the students, actually, not by the students upon anyone else.
It was like any other demonstration that you'd go on, a peaceful demonstration. We weren't looking for trouble. And as we were walking then down towards the ground, everybody was in a happy mood, as it always often is in demonstrations, you know, which I went to for many, many times with my parents, and then as a young teenager, and then as an adult. So it was like any other demonstration. Then suddenly there was this command. Police pushed us into the wall, and a very high wall, and there were boys that were climbing on top of that wall and pulling us up because we were being squashed. And you know you're being squashed, so you can't breathe. It's horrible.
We expected a little bit of demo, so to speak, but nothing quite like what happened. The rugby fraternity, oh, you know, we got to stick together, we got to play South Africa. We didn't think of the implications, and my daughters still shouted at me they didn't play in South Africa. You know, they wouldn't have allowed it if they were at that time. But it was different then. The rugby fraternity, you know, stuck together, so to speak, and any demonstrations or other interruptions were spoiling our enjoyment, so to speak. That was the attitude. It has changed, thankfully, since, but at the time, no.
There was a news blackout on Robben Island. The prisoners, including Mandela, were not allowed to receive any information from the outside world. But, uniquely, their prison warders, white Springbok fanatics to a man, were absolutely furious about the demonstrators. And they took it out on Mandela and his comrades, not realizing they were communicating something special, something precious, that here were thousands and thousands of people protesting for their freedom and to end apartheid. So he told me, after he got out of prison, it was an enormous morale boost to them at a very dark time for the anti-apartheid struggle.
I think what upset me most was that people who were supporting the rugby team and apartheid didn't understand why we were demonstrating and why we hated the regime so much. They do now.
The Springboks never toured Britain again after the Swansea event and the whole of the tour until over 20 years later. They were not allowed back into the country because everybody knew the same thing would be done except more. So it proved seismic in changing the whole nature of sporting relations between white South Africa, who'd never been South Africa, it is now, but it never was then, and Wales and England and Scotland and Ireland.
I would like you to accept our heartfelt thanks for your solidarity. We knew that the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement spoke for a people who cared for our freedom as their own.
Okay, taking this clip as our starting point then, the rest of today's event features a roundtable discussion between a distinguished panel of founders, members, protesters and historians who will together be exploring the origins, development and wider historical and cultural impact of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement. To chair this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Morwenna Osmond. Morwenna was born and raised in Penarth, a history graduate of Bristol University. Most of her research has focused on post-colonial history and the new social movements of the 60s and 70s. Her particular knowledge and interest in the anti-apartheid movement derives from her research into the St. Paul's Apartheid Free Zone campaign in Bristol in the 1980s. A warm welcome to you, Morwenna. Morwenna, you will introduce each of the panelists in turn, and I believe you'll explain how you as an audience can get involved by asking questions via the chat function in Zoom. Over to you, Morwenna.
Great, diolch yn fawr, thank you, Ian, and bore da to everyone who's with us this morning. So yeah, as that clip showed, in many ways, Britain was at the centre of the international movement opposing apartheid. Activists fought the apartheid regime on all fronts, political, economic, cultural, and as we just witnessed, the fight even reached the rugby pitch. The intensity of the action superseding even that of an England-Wales international, I think it's fair to say. So many historians view the international anti-apartheid movement as one of the most significant solidarity campaigns in modern history. Indeed, it has been argued that it should be seen as contributing to the emergence of a global civil society in the post-war era. Wales had its own small part to play in this transnational struggle, and that is what we are here to discuss today. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers, our panelists. So to begin with, Hanef Bhamjee was born in South Africa, where as a teenager, he was involved in the underground structures of the African National Congress. In 1965, when Hanef was 18, he left South Africa for Britain in order to avoid persecution. Settling in Wales in 1973, he was a founding member of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement, and as its secretary and press officer, Hanef was instrumental in growing the movement to a network of 22 branches across Wales. His house in Cardiff even served as the movement's headquarters. Hanef will be joined by Mick Antoniw, who is a Labour and cooperative politician and has been member of the Senedd for Pontypridd since 2011. He came to Cardiff in 1973 to study law and then worked as a trade union solicitor for 35 years. Mick was also a founding member of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement and has since served in the Welsh Government as Counsel General and currently chairs the Senedd's Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee. He is also a member of Labour's National Executive Committee representing the First Minister, Mark Drakeford. So next up, Hywel Francis is the president of Llafur. Along with his wife Mair, he has been a lifelong supporter of anti-colonial and anti-racist movements. He attended 5 anti-Springbok demonstrations between 1969 and 1970, and he was also the founding member of the Paul Robeson Wales Trust in 1998. As Labour MP for Aberafon, he gave one of the tributes in Parliament on the occasion of Nelson Mandela's death in 2013, in which he spoke about the development of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement. Mair Francis grew up in a communist family in the multicultural seafaring town of Barry. Being active in the Young Communist League, where she met Hywel, meant that she was active too in the peace movement, the Aldermaston marches, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations and anti-apartheid campaigns. She was heavily involved in the miners' strike of 1984-85, at which point she led the campaign to set up the Dove Women's Training Workshop, of which she is now president. And finally, Gaynor Legall will speak about how Cardiff's BME community became involved in anti-apartheid Wales, and in ways often complementary to their own anti-racist struggles. These are themes which have tended to be overlooked by historians, but which require our urgent attention. So Gaynor was born in Cardiff and has been a lifelong powerful advocate for ethnic minority women across Wales. She was the first BME woman councillor in Wales and was a founding member of the diverse Excellence Cymru and Bawsel. She was also the director of Butetown History and Art Cultural Centre, and following its closure, established another heritage organisation called the Heritage and Cultural Exchange, of which she is chair. She has since been awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the ethnic minority Welsh Women Achievement Association, and most recently, Gaynor was appointed by Wales's First Minister, Mark Drakeford, to lead a task and finish group that will audit all public statues, buildings and street names in Wales in order to address its history of racism and connections with the slave trade. So those are our panelists. I think that's over to you now, Mick. I think Hanef may be having some trouble joining us. So if Mick, you'd like to talk about the origins and development of anti-apartheid. in Wales.
Okay, a few reminiscences then, because I came to Cardiff in '73. That's where I met Hanef and became involved in the anti-apartheid movement, really hearing Hanef and a few others who were quite powerful speakers, very emotive speakers at the time. And I think it's also important to remember that sort of environment in the early 70s. There was a sense of internationalism in that there was the anti-apartheid campaign. There'd been Sharpeville. There was a growing awareness of that. And of course, there'd been the Springbok demonstrations. But there was also the Vietnam War that was running. We had Kissinger came to Cardiff in the early 70s, and a mass demonstration was there. And there was also Chile. And the reason I mention these is because I think they represented a sort of cross-party, beyond partisan politics on internationalism, which I'm not sure really exists to the same scale now. You went to meetings, it didn't matter which political party you were in or whatever, there weren't particular lines. There was an internationalism and international solidarity. I was involved, obviously, in student politics at the time with Hanef, and we'd been organised in a whole variety of demonstration. And it's true to say that in the 70s, the anti-apartheid movement went into a lull. It's, as with many of these campaigns, you have real activity for a number of years, and then it goes into a sort of doldrums for a while, and it's the sort of hardcore that keep it actually going. But I remember in around about 78, I think it was, the Barbars were playing in Swansea and, in Llanelli. And therefore, there were a lot of focusing around matches that were taking place in the Llanelli area. And we had the anti-apartheid movement, but it wasn't then a Welsh anti-apartheid movement. It was part of the UK anti-apartheid movement. And I mention this because I think what was important was that the movement began to develop a very clear Welsh identity. We'd had the devolution referendum in '79. By the '80s, there was a very, very clear need to be able to specifically represent Welsh culture, Welsh politics in a unique way, but as part of that movement. And so around about 77, 78, I was president of the National Union of Students in Wales, and I was sat in my office in Swansea with Hanef, and we were wondering what we were going to do, how we're going to organise around the demonstrations and the marches. We'd spoken to Hywel's dad about about getting the NUM more engaged.
But I'm not around.
Hanef, and with other trade unions. And we actually rang through then to someone who'd been a very strong activist with the anti-apartheid movement, Neil Kinnock. And we rang through to Neil and said, Neil, we're thinking of, organising this. Any ideas? And he said, well, why don't you set up, call the outfit the South Wales Campaign Against Racism in Sport. And that was really the precursor, I think, to the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement per se, because it took on that Welsh identity and the demonstrations. I mean, my job in this was sort of awkward. I was sort of sent around from time to time to go and buy the smoke bombs and so on. So with an anti-apartheid check, that was the difficulties at the time. But certainly we had enormous demonstrations there. And then in the early 80s, I think we had a meeting and we decided then, and I think Hanef will be appropriate to come in here in a minute, decided at a meeting in, I think, April 1981, that what we needed was a very specific Welsh organisation to represent us.
Sorry to join, I'm late. Terribly sorry.
Hi, Hanef.
I'm here now, I think, yeah.
Hanef, I've just taken us up to about 1981, but obviously you'll do your own reminiscences. I don't want to take all the time because I know how precious time is in this debate. But in about April 1981, I think a meeting chaired by Di Francis, a number of other key trade unionists and activists at the time, we decided that we would formally set up our own organisation, the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement. That did send quite a shockwave through to the anti-apartheid movement, which had tended to operate in a very centralised way. But it was specifically because we had a whole series of issues. There was the Jones Choir going to South Africa. There were more rugby tours coming over. We had Shirley Bassey going to Sun City, and there were demonstrations about that cultural issue. There was the Eisteddfod, where you had these Welsh persons living abroad would become to the Eisteddfod, including from South Africa, where there was a big connection. So the Welsh identification was, I think, what consolidated and allowed the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement to actually become, I think, one of the most effective campaigning bodies within the anti-apartheid movement. I think probably at this stage I should hand over to Hanef to carry on.
Yeah, the date 1981 was just a complete accident. The problem was this: the Di in particular said that it must be an all-Welsh organization to get more attention. But this was said in about 1976, 77 after the Soweto massacre. And my argument and that of Mick was, we don't have branches all over Wales yet, so we can't call ourselves a Welsh organization. I'm sorry I'm breathless, but I'll do my best. So we started setting up branches, and it was hard work. Because contrary to most expectations, I discovered a hell of a lot of racism wherever I went. And we had a hell of a job convincing people that we were anti-racist, we're not anti-white. But people had cousins in South Africa, relatives, one sort or another. And the other problem was the rugby factor. But we persevered, and there were only a handful of people at the time. Gaynor, Mick, Chris Short, Hywel Francis, very critical member at the time because he was in contact with most people that we knew, that he knew. And Bert Pearce of the Communist Party provided us with many contacts. So by about 1981, we had 18 to 19 branches, and eventually that grew to about 22, which excludes branches from students' unions and colleges. But I would say that 1981 was the time when we had all these branches more or less set up, or we had committees in various parts. So we launched it in April 1981. It coincided with our Rugby International, which didn't please Hywel Francis very much. But at that meeting, there were 200 odd people. And I'm very pleased to say that there were lots of trade unionists, but there weren't very many trade unionists in the afternoon. They disappeared because of the Rugby International. I don't know who was playing. One of the big problems we had everywhere we went, though, was that we were tarnished with the fact that we were picking on Welsh rugby. Now, most of our activities throughout the period was on the consumer boycott and the economic aspects. For example, the boycott of Barclays Bank didn't happen overnight. Them pulling out of South Africa was as a result of massive campaigns, mainly in the student movement, but also in councils. And many councils pulled out of South Africa as a result of trade unions activity in the councils. Barclays began to realize it was losing a lot of customers. And today's student is tomorrow's doctor, etc. But it was difficult convincing the people that we were mainly concerned with the consumer boycott and economic sanctions against South Africa because we weren't getting the publicity. We tried everything possible, all-day sanction events in the whole of Wales. Various months would be a boycott against sanctions, a boycott against Tesco's, boycott against various banks. But slowly and gradually it worked. And I would say that the student element was a fundamental factor in promoting this because the students came from all over Wales and we could then concentrate on the branches, asking them for help to say, where are you from? Swazi, Mahantlas, or wherever. And the local involvement of people was critical because when I went to various parts of Wales, after a time and learning from bitter experience, we didn't just go for one day. If I was invited to a meeting in North Wales, I would arrange various meetings for a whole week and use the meetings to meet students, churches, trade unions, go to a trades council meeting, and use a whole week to do lots of meetings, not just one visit to Flint, something like that. That was very difficult to convince people, look, we've got a lot of things now. And essentially, by about 1983, 84, we'd become a household name. We had meetings of a clandestine nature constantly with the Welsh officials from the WRU. And the problem with those meetings was that even to date, I've asked some of the people, can I use your name in terms of the fact that we persuaded WRU to finally break links in 1989? They said no. They won't allow me to use their names. And some of these names are pretty high up, executive committee members, really high up officials of the WRU. Not many are alive now, but they told me not to mention their names. The activities that took place, mainly the main towns tended to be Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and Wrexham. But in every area we had contacts, largely due to the Labour Party and Communist Party individuals who constantly campaigning and doing as we wanted. The activities that we participated in at the nationalised Stedford were very important because we had a tremendous support in the cultural community in Wales. In the cultural community, whether it was with historians or writers, artists, we didn't need to persuade people. There was a genuinely committed crowd of people. Many of Wales' leading writers, for example, were involved in signing a petition to the Welsh Arts Council to persuade them to break links with South Africa. They had invited people from the South African Broederbond. The Broederbond was like a mafia organization in South Africa, and it controlled everything. And almost every leading writer in Wales appended his name to this petition, calling for an end to apartheid. Just to go back to something that Mick said about 1981, when we set up the anti-apartheid movement in Wales, there was a tremendous amount of opposition from England. And surprisingly, even some of the Scottish people disagreed with it. The idea was we should form a Scottish committee, a Welsh committee of the anti-apartheid movement. And we said, what the hell is the difference? We formed a Welsh Anti-Apartheid Movement. And from then on, branches just mushroomed. The fact that they realized this was an autonomous Welsh organization. And we were tremendously helped by attacks that were made on us. People who called us racists, they called us terrorists. But as you probably know, Mandela was called a terrorist by the Conservative Party right up to his release. But the formation of the anti-apartheid movement as such met with this opposition. Financially, we were completely at a loss as to what to do. Now, people were contributing $5 or $10 a month, but that barely covered administrative costs. The idea was to try and raise enough money to at least pay the secretary, me. That never happened because you never raised enough money. And most of the money that was raised just went into campaigns and travel expenses. So we depended very largely on local support, and that came from the state's councils, local churches, local student groupings. But the question that really bugs me even up to this day is, why is it that none of those sanctions campaigns, etc., caught the media's eye as much as the protests against the WRU? We became a household name, but I think a lot of it was to do with our protests against the WRU because that caught the eye. In 1989, when they finally broke links, we had penetrated many rugby clubs at high level, and we were assisted in this break of the WRU with South Africa, which is the only rugby union in the world to break links with South Africa, was the Welsh one, by a number of factors. One is the fact that there were many people in the WRU who were not happy with links with South Africa. But the second thing was the South African interference in the WRU. They couldn't send letters of invitation to the South African centenary to the WRU itself because it would have been rejected. So the WRU said they will not send a WRU team to South Africa. So what they did was they hired a Welsh lawyer to do all the work, to be their transit man. Terry Vaux, his name was. He can't sue me for libel because it's true. He's based in Newport or in the valleys, and he was getting all these emails of invitation to the players. And they were each paid about 25 grand to go. They bypassed the WRU committee. When that happened, of course, the WRU secretary, Ray East, resigned, and so did the then president, whose name skips me for a second. That caused a hell of a stir. Call a general meeting, specifically on one issue. And the manner in which those resolutions at that meeting were written, somebody was convinced that I had written them for the WRU, which is not true. We didn't write any of the resolutions. We might have provided information. The WRU voted overwhelmingly to break links with South Africa in 1989. Ray East didn't go back. The president went back. But from then on, it just was full flow for us. The Anti-Apartheid Movement was called by the WRU guys the most powerful pressure group in Wales. I think that was a truth which many other people have repeatedly stated. The meetings that brought about the movement were either small, meaning of 3 people, or very big ones, meaning of 300-400 people. And the other thing that we did that was very effective in establishing us was that we had people from all parts of the community, even Tories. We had started in the 70s, but before that, there were lots of people in the black community and throughout Wales who had been involved.
Hanef, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I think we're on such a tight time schedule, and there's so many interesting people and so much to hear. So I think if you could just wrap up, and then we'll move on to Mair and Hywel, who were. So we've heard from the leaders, the founding members of the Anti-Apartheid in Wales, and now we'll hear from 2 activists who are very involved. So Mair and Hywel.
Okay, thank you, Morwenna. I'm going to talk a bit about my background and the impact that women had on my life in the anti-apartheid movement and beyond. So I was brought up in the 1950s in a politically conscious family. My parents, as you said, were members of the Communist Party. So I was aware of many injustices, such as the lack of educational opportunities, poverty and unemployment in Barry. From a young age, I attended demonstrations for world peace, marches against the nuclear bomb and against the anti-working class policies of the Conservative government. My parents organised the Barry branch of the Communist Party, so there were many discussions that took place in our living room on the current political situations, and the situation in South Africa in particular would have been discussed at that time. I had many friends in the Colcut. It was a working class council housing estate in Barry who were from mixed heritage backgrounds, and I was encouraged by my parents to support my friends when they encountered any racism. In fact, one of the families were a mixed race family who I believe had to leave South Africa and seek sanctuary in Wales. So I had a rich and cultural background. I want to use this opportunity to mention a woman of colour who was well known in her community and highly respected and loved in the Colquitt estate. On International Women's Day 2013, the Vale of Glamorgan Council established the Barry Women's Trail, celebrating women who had made significant contributions to public life. They included doctors, nurses, local politicians, including Dorothy Rees, the first female MP for Industrial South Wales, Irene White, a determined anti-racist who supported Paul Robeson, women from the arts, teachers, and also my mother, Hilda Hay-Price, a campaigner and as an airframe fitter during World War II at St. Athens Airfield. She was an active trade unionist with the AEU, fighting for equal opportunities for women. Now, my parents' friends were Darwin Hines and his sister, Gwen Hines Payne. Elected in 1958, Darwin was the first Caribbean and Muslim mayor in the UK and Wales, and when he joined the council, he was one of only 3 Welsh-speaking councillors. Gwen was elected as the councillor in the Calcutta in 1972. She became Darwin's Lady Mayoress in 1975 and one of the first black women councillors in Wales. Gwen would often encourage my mother to join the Labour Party and put herself forward to be a councillor. They had enormous respect for each other. But what is striking is that Gwen was not included in this celebration of women's lives. The trail paid tribute to 17 famous Barry women, certainly an oversight which can easily be corrected. There is currently a campaign through the local newspaper and Facebook to name a new community centre in Barry after Gwen. And so by acknowledging this campaign, current campaign on Black Lives Matter, we should use this opportunity to recognise Gwen. So let's hope it'll be successful. Now, as you saw from the BBC film, I was at the Swansea demonstration. Just a little bit of personal information that my father was very strict regarding the boycotting of goods from South Africa. This became a very strict rule in our house, and I supported the boycott for many years. And then you could see on the film that I was involved in the Springboks tour of 1968 and involved in the demonstrations at Newport, Cardiff twice, Ebbw Vale and Swansea. And of course, what was happening then in 1969 is what we now know was being kettled by the police. So I'll pass on to Hywel now.
Bore da pawb. Penblwydd hapus I Nelson Mandela. Good morning, everyone. I understand today is Nelson Mandela's birthday. As we've already heard, the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement didn't come from nowhere. It had many origins, and I want to talk about 2 in particular, the Miners' Union and the Church. The Miners' Union believing in international working class solidarity, and the Church believing in Christian fellowship, but both believing in what we now call universal human rights. This involved for us challenging the traditional male domains of rugby and choral music, and their so-called right, and we've heard a little bit about it already, to enjoyment, and that's not a million miles away from singing Delilah today. This is also a story about collective memory being challenged by collective amnesia. And in Wales, the cultural boycott proved, as we've already heard from Hanef, to be as important as the sports boycott. I want to do this, I want to tell my story through a personal timeline which involves largely my father, who's already been mentioned before, a one-time Sunday school teacher, a communist miners' union leader, member of the Movement for Colonial Freedom, a friend of Paul Robeson, and, as we've heard, the first chair of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement. I begin in 1938 in 2 places in the valleys, Mountain Ash and Crynant. Paul Robeson sings and speaks at the memorial to the Welshman who died fighting fascism in the Spanish Civil War. He personified the universal struggles against fascism and colonialism and appears alongside a large contingent of black people from Cardiff and Basque refugees. Also in 1938, C.L.R. James, author of the Black Jacobins, the first successful slave rebellion, he's the historian, and he wrote the Black Jacobins. And he visited not just Crynant, but the house in which we now live. He was a friend of Brynley and Tilly Griffiths, active in the Independent Labour Party. And he was not one person, but one of many who represented the early links between the anti-colonial struggles in the 1930s with the wider progressive and labour movement in Britain. And then just 20 years later, 1957, incarcerated in his own country because his passport had been confiscated, Paul Robeson sings by transatlantic link to the miners' Eisteddfod in Porthcawl. The son of a slave, he more than anyone of his generation raises awareness in Britain and especially Wales of the modern day legacy of slavery, European colonialism and lynchings and segregation in the US and South Africa. 1960, Royal Festival Hall, London. Paul Robeson sings with the Cumbach Male Voice Choir at a concert organised by the Movement for Colonial Freedom. We as a family travelled up from Cumbach because my father was the president of the choir and union official active in the Movement for Colonial Freedom. The compere, Alfie Bass, friend of Paul Robeson, links the anti-Semitism he suffered with the racism suffered by black people the world over. And for me, 1964, the defining moment, the emergence of the anti-apartheid movement in Wales. Llandaff Cathedral, all-night vigil there, along with churches and cathedrals all over the world, organised by the World Council of Churches, in solidarity with Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and all the other comrades in the African National Congress who were on trial in the Rivonia trial and likely to be hanged the following day. And as a non-believer, the only time I've ever believed that the power of prayer was very significant. My father said, we're going to Llandaff tonight. And I thought that was quite a strange thing for him to do as a lifelong atheist. And I went as a young communist with my friend, Harry Davis, who's a young conservative, who now lives in Africa, interestingly enough. That was the moment of departure as far as I'm concerned. And the great Bishop Glyn Simon read with the Dean, Errol S. Thomas, passages from the New Testament all through the night into the dawn. 1967, Cardiff Rugby Club, tour South Africa. Our racism at home is revealed when the black player, Frankie Wilson, is dropped in order to make it convenient for the all-white Cardiff team to tour South Africa. There were protests by West Wales clubs, and this reminded us of the treatment that had already been meted out to other great rugby players, Billy Boston, Clive Sullivan, and of course Roy Francis. All of that came to mind. And of course, Frankie is the uncle of Ryan Giggs. And this is all the forerunner to what we've been discussing earlier, 1969, 1970. Mair and I were students, and as you've already heard, we were at the demonstrations. The real solidarity was not Swansea. People overlook the very great significance of the Cardiff demonstrations. More people were on the demonstrations in Cardiff than there were in the matches themselves. There was a broad coalition of the miners, the wider labour movement, and the kayaks, the Cardiff International Athletic Club. And for me, the second moment of departure was in the Cardiff game where the black community marches up, and you'll hear a bit about this later from Gaynor, and joins us. And the kayaks made a banner, and the kayaks were led by the great boxer Joey Erskine. And when the black and white united at that moment, and I referred to it in Parliament, David Lammy said that he was very moved by that particular description. The chanting in those demonstrations were very significant. Don't scrum with a racist bum and paint them black and send them back. I don't know whether we'd use that slogan now. My father announces in Corey Hall at the end of the Wales game, there was a rally afterwards, and he said, "This is a day of shame when the people's game is played behind barbed wire." If you look closely at the moment where Gareth Edwards, sadly, son of a miner, goes over and scores in the corner, that terrace there is completely empty, which signified how few people actually went to that game. And of course, it was a day of shame as well, because there were so many sons of Welsh miners playing in that game. Then 1981, just after my father had died, Cumbach Male Voice Choir was stopped from going touring in South Africa under their name by local opposition. and my father was the president of that choir. I addressed the choir and read letters to them from Paul Robeson Jr. and Colin Winter, the Bishop of Namibia in exile. We had a rally in Pontypridd, and Hanef and I spoke at that rally. I was accompanied on the visit to meet the choir by the local Member of Parliament, the late Ioan Evans, Labour and Cooperative MP, who had worked for the Anglican International Defence and Aid Fund set up by Canon Collins. And he had worked in South Africa. And of course, that organisation was actually made illegal under the suppression of the so-called Suppression of Communism Act. Then finally, 1984-85, Ystalvera in the Swansea Valley, black church leaders from South Africa visiting the South Wales coalfield told striking miners and church leaders, will you please stop talking about peace? You will never get peace unless you first struggle for justice. And a member of a local women's support group, a friend of ours, Jan Burrell, told me at that time, when meeting these South African church leaders, she'd been taught to sing Kosi Sikelera I Afrika in Sunday school in the 1950s by visiting what she called Black South African missionaries, which is a rather interesting twist of history given what the role of Christian missionaries were, white Christian missionaries were in Africa in the 19th century. So there was much more to the struggle than rugby. The cultural boycott was very important, as we've heard from Hanef. The student movement was very significant. And most of all, as we will now hear, the black community in Cardiff and elsewhere, all of them have their stories of solidarity to tell.
Great, thank you very much, Mair and Hywel. So now over to Gaynor.
Hi everyone. Again, I'll do a little timeline thing, but I'm not very good at remembering actual dates, etc. One date that sticks in my mind is September 1969, when I was at a dance at Town Community Centre and 4 men walked in. Their names were Ali Sobers, Gula Mayet, Harry Joshua, and Peter Moyet. And they were students at Cardiff University. And we got to know them. And that was when I really began to understand what apartheid was like and what was happening in South Africa. To go back in history, my uncles were seamen, and they had always talked about they could not have shore leave when they were in South Africa, and the things that they had to do to get sort of supplies. So I knew about South Africa and I knew about apartheid, but the meeting of those men really began my politicization. And we eventually started an organization. We called it the Black Alliance because it was an alliance of people who agreed with our agenda, who were anti-racist, who wanted to fight against discrimination, and they were black and they were white because of the nature of the people who lived in Bhutan. So the Cardiff Anti-Apartheid Movement wasn't yet in place. What we had was the Black Alliance. But Graham talked a lot about the anti-apartheid movement. So we decided that we would start what we called Cardiff Anti-Apartheid. But as has been already said, it was controlled very much by London. So people would come from London and tell us we needed to get involved in this and we needed to get involved in that. The organisation was very active, and remember we all marched into town to commemorate the Sharpsville massacre. And when we got outside David Morgan's, as it was then, some of the men had guns, artificial guns with caps in them, and they shot they let the guns off, and all the women had to fall on the floor. A little bit about, you know, check the feminism about that, but that's the way we did. We dyed the water in the fountain outside the city hall red, to symbolize the bloodshed that had been spilled in South Africa. But some people talked about the cultural boycott. That didn't touch us as much, but one of the things that did was the boycott of goods. So we did not buy any South African goods whatsoever. And then when we got involved in the Chile as well, we didn't buy any goods from Chile. It was a long time before I ate an orange. And in Butte Town, I don't think it was really understood. So we were ostracized. Our fight was already there. Our battle was about the racism that existed in Cardiff. And in particular, the way in which the police acted and the brutality of the police force. So when we started going to the local shops, trying to get them not to buy South African goods, and saying in our homes and telling our children they mustn't eat anything that was from South Africa, our parents, etc., didn't agree with it at all. We met in Butte Town Community Centre until a group of us were banned because the community saw us as troublemakers. And I've got to say that until the kayaks joined in and marched, we were not accepted. And the methods that we were choosing to demonstrate was seen as troublemakers looking for trouble. And I've got to say that Nino Abdi and Gulam and Harry Joshua did a lot of work with the kayaks, trying to convince them to get involved and to come on the demonstration. But when they did, the kayaks were there, they understood, the whole community then came behind us. So we started Cardiff Anti-Apartheid, and as I said, we were involved in lots of demonstrations. What used to happen on those demonstrations, and I remember one in particular, I think it was about 1969 in Cardiff. As we were heading towards the demonstrations, the police tried to intercept us, and a lot of the young guys got arrested before they even got onto the demonstrations. At the demonstrations, we singled the black guys out. And one demonstration I particularly remember, and I can't remember if it was in Llanelli or Ebervale, when the police used horses and we were herded into a side street, and it was absolutely terrifying. And a woman came out, and there were three of us together, and the woman opened the door and said, "Come in here." And she led us into the house because we were sort of trapped there. And then Hanef came on the scene. I met Hanef actually, first of all, before he came to Cardiff, in London. And he came to Cardiff and we discussed starting a bigger, more organised movement. And that's when Wales Anti-Apartheid began, and you've all heard the stories of that. From a perspective of Butte Town, someone coming from Butte Town, someone who was born in Wales, black, of black parentage. For me, that I was torn. I was angry that people were getting involved about issues that were to do with South Africa, about the racism that was in South Africa, and were not paying as much attention to the racism that was going on in Wales. it's a silly, well, it's not silly, but a small example. Mair mentioned Gwen and Darwin. I am constantly referred to as the first Black woman councillor. And every time I correct, even today, I added first Black city councillor. Nobody catches on to that. And so the contribution that Black people in Wales has made over the decades, from the First World War and before, the fact that they were miners and an ambulance in the first aid corps of miners in the 1920s and 30s, that history seems to have been lost. The Pan-African movement, the anti-colonial movement, the way in which people from Butte Town, Black men from Butte Town, were organised in issues that were international is not written down as part of our history. And I think that my ambivalence around the anti-apartheid movement that lied in that, it's to some extent in that. And I think that for British people, it is sometimes easier to see the bad things that are going on elsewhere rather than the bad things that are going on within their own countries. One of the things that Hanef did with Wales Anti-Apartheid was to try and make those links. And so, unlike what went on in England, there were always large numbers of Black people involved in Wales Anti-Apartheid, whereas in England it was quite a separate thing. In Wales and in Cardiff, we saw the benefits of being involved and the benefits of learning from what went on in South Africa in terms of taking another issue forward. So the movement for me, the establishment of that 1969 meeting, those four men, Ghulam, who was already involved in South Africa when he came here and ran away like Hanef from South Africa to avoid prosecution. Some of them who were from the Caribbean and involved in movements that were to do with anti-Black discrimination and independence, taught me to look at issues on a global stage, and helped me to understand that if we were going to make any change at all, then we really had to work together. I think that's okay. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you so much, Gaynor, and to all of our panellists. That's been very, very interesting. So we're going to have a 10-minute discussion just between the panellists, and then we'll move on to a 10-minute Q&A session. So if you have questions that have popped up during the talks, then now would be the time to type them in the chat box. So I kind of just want to leave it up to the panellists to have a discussion. I'm sure you all have questions for each other. Before I hand over to you, Mick, one thing that I have found interesting as a student of as a recent student of the anti-apartheid movement is that in scholarship that's coming out at the moment, the big emphasis is on how the international anti-apartheid movement was focused on internationalism. It's been characterized as a new social movement that departed from earlier social movements, and that the focus is more on concepts like international human rights than necessarily stuff to do with economic well-being. And so the focus for historians at the moment has been looking at the kind of transnational links and the internationalism embedded in anti-apartheid activism. But what historians also seem to have found is that national anti-apartheid movements took on distinctive national characteristics, and actually it was really important for anti-apartheid movements in different countries to kind of draw on the national identity to which they were appealing to. And so yeah, I mean, if in your discussion you could touch upon that. I know that Hanef and Mick both emphasised that it was really important and to have a distinctly Welsh movement. So in your discussion, if you could draw on that, that would be very interesting to me, and I'm sure to lots of people. So if I hand over to you, Mick.
I just a couple of short things because others have got really important things to contribute. This was one of the first anti-apartheid Wales anti-apartheid badges we produced. I don't know if you see it, but
Yes.
it had the dragon emblazoned through it, and of course our bilingualism, use of the Welsh language, to ensure that we represented the whole of Wales. It was the Namibia badge because there was the broader South African struggle. But I want to make one thing: how important the South African security services saw the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement and the Anti-Apartheid Movement generally. We know about the attempts to frame Peter Hain that was set up by Boss, but also the bombing of the Anti-Apartheid office in London. And of course, when the security services, the British security services, were involved in that, and they uncovered the list of names of the hit list, people might not have realized that, of course, Hanif's name was on that hit list. And at that time, we had an office in City Road that we operated from, and it was necessary for the security services for a period of time to be following Hanif around. I remember accompanying you, Hanif, on one time. We visited a couple of pubs, and I think the security services complained about that afterwards. But how seriously the security services regarded the anti-apartheid movement in the UK, and also specifically within Wales, in terms of the impact it was having on their reputation and their international politics.
Well, they admitted that they couldn't infiltrate the anti-apartheid movement executive in Wales. They just couldn't enter. Well, we didn't plan that. It's just that the people who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement at the executive level were always people that we knew very perfectly well and trusted. We kept a lot of things quiet, even from the executive. We had to. But generally speaking, we were informed by people that I know very well in South Africa now. The documents they found unearthed after 1994 said the anti-apartheid movement was impenetrable. They even sent us a Portuguese activist over to us, who later transferred to be a copper for the Portuguese Secret Service and South Africa, to Wales, thinking that we'd believe him. We didn't. Well, I didn't let him into the house. Talking about the police situation, the other problem was the houses where I lived in were broken into 4 times during that period, and nothing was taken. Nothing was taken except the filing cabinet broken into, etc. The police were very well aware of that, but nothing was ever discovered. Nobody knew. Nobody could prove who the burglars were.
Look.
But the collaboration with the South African police and the local British police was obvious from the start.
I see there's a question on Shirley Bassey, which is an interesting one, Gaynor.
I can't see that. Where is the? Oh yeah, yeah.
Kate Law, I wonder if you could shed some light, because I remember it well, because a photo appeared of you meeting Shirley Bassey as a young child. And of course, she was a sort of cultural hero to Cardiff. So it was a real challenge, again, to, the institutionalized racism, wasn't it, within the city, that we were there protesting outside her concert, wasn't it? You remember?
Absolutely. It's pouring down with rain, and we were still outside for hours. But yes, the South Wales Echo put a photograph of me. I think I was about 8 years of age, presenting Shirley with a bouquet before she started her first world tour or something like that. And then with me with holding a bag saying, "Shame on you, Shirley." And because I'm dyslexic, I misspelled shame, so it poster actually read, "Shame on you, Shirley." I've got a copy of that. It was interesting because Shirley Bassey was not as popular within Bute Town as she was in the rest of Wales. So, again, throughout this campaign, there are contradictions, and people took sides and stands about it. But yes, we stood. That was a campaign that really was part of the the cultural, like where we tried to stop people actually going to South Africa for entertainment, and to actually identify somebody who was black and well known, who went to Sin City. I call it Sin City. Raise the profile a lot, because part of the difficulty of the anti-apartheid movement, the Wales Anti-Apartheid, was keeping the interest going, keeping the, you know, people involved. Like Hanef said, we never raised enough money to give him a wage, but you know, just keeping people interested and supporting the activities we were doing.
Tom Jones signed a declaration to say he'll never go back to South Africa again.
That's
Shirley
right.
Bassey signed it, and then later said that she didn't go to South Africa. She went to an independent country called Botswana, capital of that was Sun City. The South Africans had set up these so-called homelands, and she claimed she went to this homeland and not South Africa. Well, the United Nations never removed her from the list of entertainers that they had who'd been to South Africa, and refused to apologize for their actions. Tom Jones did, she didn't. Somebody's put his question in about internationalism, the miners. I think it's very important to mention this because the miners were important in setting up the anti-apartheid movement and were at many demonstrations, but they were also at the rugby matches, we shouldn't forget. But the internationalism dating back from the Spanish Civil War, we could say, you look at 1945 onwards, there was a strong link between the Welsh miners and South Africa. But we couldn't find evidence of this, whether it was minuted or not. I've been through the minutes of the Welsh NUM, and I can't find a single reference to the fact that from 1945 onwards, the South Wales area NUM was sending delegations to South Africa. In fact, there was a bit of a problem at one stage where Heathfield, General Secretary of the NUM, confronted the anti-apartheid movement on the issue of the boycott. Because whilst the boycott was on, the NUM, nationally and locally, was still sending miners to South Africa for political reasons, to show their solidarity. And the argument of the NUM at the time was that, yes, boycott South Africa, but we don't boycott the opponents of apartheid. And the miners were sending money to South Africa even during the Welsh miners' strike. And the South African NUM told me to give them back to the miners here, because that money wasn't necessary for the NUM to fight against apartheid, against the British state. So the links was very, very strong.
So
can I just say, sorry, can I just say one of the other bits in terms of getting support? The councils, and I was a member of Cardiff City Council, and they were adamant, it was Tory-led, they were adamantly against anti-apartheid and saw Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. But trying to get the establishments to join us was a piece of work on its own, and a lot of work went in behind the scenes, trying to lobby the council and councillors to support us. So I found it ironic. Well, Nelson Mandela was given the freedom of the city of Cardiff, the number of people who lined up to say that they'd be involved. They had been absolutely silent and absent throughout the campaign. But there you are.
There were three figures that were very important as well, you say on the councils, because nearly all the councils, all the Labour councils, decided to remove the rate relief for the Welsh Rugby Union, etc. Cardiff did, and then locally as well, and that was in sort of protest at their links with South Africa.
Mm.
But Phil Squires, who was the leader of Mid Glamorgan Council, did an awful lot to organise the council leaders in support. And I think it should be said, I know different political parties, the role that David Ellis Thomas and David Ewan played actually on that
Absolutely.
cultural side. You know, that shouldn't be forgotten, because
Absolutely.
they'd moved into a sort of a more common progressive ambit. And David Ellis Thomas was there always on every demonstration I was ever on. He was there, certainly in London and so on. And David Ewan, in terms of his music, solidarity with Chile, but also solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. And I think those were important parts in the development of the cultural boycott, because the cultural boycott was something that was particularly unique to Wales, and I think that's why it stood out, starting from the Jones Choir in particular as well.
There's something else. A question was asked on a number of occasions. How is it that the black community in Cardiff was so involved, or in Wales was so involved compared to London? I think there was a problem in the beginnings in anti-apartheid in London. Some of my anti-apartheid London members won't like to hear this. There was a reluctance to get too involved in the anti-racist struggle in the UK because they wanted anti-apartheid to be a broad-based movement. However, in Wales, it was the other way around. The anti-apartheid movement got heavily involved in the anti-racist movement and was in many ways at the forefront of the anti-racist movement in Wales. And that attracted a lot of black people. And it didn't happen so much in any other part of the UK. I don't know why, but that seems to be the reason, not lack of involvement in the local community. Whereas when I came to Cardiff, I found that going to Butetown was a central thing every weekend or every other weekend, not just for social reasons, but to mobilize activity in the area. And when I went to speak in large meetings, and that was a big problem at that time, going to meetings was they wanted a South African, and the only bloody South African around in Wales was prepared to do meetings with me. The others didn't want to go. So we went to these meetings, but it attracted local black people in Wrexham, etc. Suddenly a black person will arrive at a meeting and somebody say, "Where are you from? And how come we haven't met you before?" The Labour Party people, they're in the Labour Party. No, I came along because I heard of the meeting on anti-apartheid. The young kids in Neath, born and bred in Wales, turning up at anti-apartheid meetings. So there was a close link with the black community from the very outset. I didn't start it. People like Gaynor and a South African called Mair. And people ask, why did this happen? I think it was largely due to the presence of 2 or 3 South Africans who had been involved in South Africa politically, who got involved with the black community in Cardiff.
So one more question we have here.
There's an important one from Anne Lamont there, which we haven't mentioned, and that is Soweto, the impact the '76 Soweto uprising had. And she mentioned, I'd forgotten it, the visit of students in after Soweto, the impact that had. Hanef probably say a bit more about that. Or?
Yeah, we had three students. One of them was in the leadership of the Soweto Representative Council. That, for people who don't know, on June 16, 1976, the police shot dead over 160 black kids in one school area, and the resistance spread very fast. And in that year, 1976, is known as the year of Soweto. Over 1,000 school kids which were shot dead by the police. Schools were shut, and many of those young people fled South Africa and went into exile. We eventually joined the military wing of the ANC and went back to fight. But for young people in this country, Soweto was on the headlines every day for about a month in June, and it politicized a lot of people. We in Wales have a Soweto walk every year to raise funds to send to charities in South Africa. And that started very soon after the Soweto massacre. But in '76, in the Students' Union, in schools, etc., throughout the country, people were talking about Soweto because they couldn't help it. It was on the news every day, pictures of children being shot dead. Soweto politicized a lot of people.
So, thank you for that. So I think we'll go till 12:30 with questions, and then I'll pass back over to Ian to wrap up. But I think one other question we have here is, so one thing that has struck me today are the many references to a particular Welsh anti-colonial, anti-racist history, Robeson, etc. My question to all participants is, how conscious was this? How important was it to you to be building a Welsh response to apartheid? Hywel and Mair, do you have anything? Do you want to come on in there? Just because we haven't heard from you yet.
It's interesting what Mick said, you know, that initially it was perceived of as being a South Wales or Cardiff and South Wales phenomenon. But very quickly, and one of the positive things that came out of the defeat of the 79 referendum was that there was a concerted effort to see things more through a Welsh perspective. And the cultural boycott, I think, became ever more important, and the role that the nationalised Steddfod played. There was a real battleground, really. It hasn't been mentioned. Hanef and Mick played a part in this, and I was in the meetings shortly after my father died about how to deal with the international Eisteddfod in Llangollen, and that was being penetrated by South Africa, and the then president, Lord Alun Chalfont, was a great supporter of apartheid South Africa, and that was a really important battleground, really. And so it became ever more Welsh. I think the Welsh Language Society and the churches, the Welsh Council of Churches led by Noel Davis. I remember him leading churches on demonstrations from the time of Blair Peach and the Anti-Nazi League, the demonstrations in Cardiff around that. So yes, there was that momentum, and of course during the miners' strike, the struggle of the miners became a national struggle as well, and we created the Wales Congress in support of mining communities. So that phenomenon emerged very interestingly in the 80s, and I've argued that a lot of those movements then, those social movements, prepared the ground for the successful vote in 1997 for devolution.
Does anyone else want to come in there?
Well, I'll go, Hanef, go on.
The anti-apartheid movement was very heavily involved in encouraging a link between the Welsh language-speaking people and South Africa. The Welsh Language Society was very, very active in any of the anti-apartheid campaign we had, not only in North Wales but everywhere else. I spoke to the Welsh Language Society in English. I was only the second person in history to do that, and politically important. The first was Emlyn Williams of the NUM. Shows the politics of the Welsh Language Society. There were times when the Welsh language people were as effective as the presence of black activists in setting up branches in different parts of Wales. And that is because of the anti-apartheid movement's bilingual policy.
Mick or Gaynor, anything to add there?
I just wanted to say, remember Hanef and I having these discussions about the bilingualism and, you know, paint them black and send them back and stuff. They tipped off the tongue. We probably wouldn't use them now. But we're trying to develop slogans that could be translated, and apartheid Akavi didn't, you know, and discussing that type of thing was, it took up, you know, but it seems a small thing, but it was really important. If we were going to bring people on board and get people to work with us, one of the, I used to go on the demonstrations and the meetings, and I always took my children, my nieces and nephews with me. And we still talk about these long bus journeys up to North Wales and the rest of it. But you know, you know, the unintended consequences. I think for me, the people in Butte Town that were involved in those actually learned more about Wales, you know, because there's a tendency you stay where you are. So it was about, we learned about each other and about each other's culture. And although there were problems with the Welsh Language Society initially, I mean, they did embrace it and come on board. And I think that was a benefit to them as much as it was to the anti-apartheid movement.
I think something that was very unique about the anti-apartheid movement and what it symbolized politically and emotionally was that it actually took people who ended up devoting a large part of their lives to a single cause, and that cause of sort of equality and justice. And you see it to this day. I mean, you see the meetings now, everyone's a bit fatter, everyone's got grayer hair, not looking at anyone in particular. But it was a particularly unique movement. And I hope one thing that does come out of this, Hanef, because I know you keep promising, we really do have to have the history of this movement properly written up. And properly recorded before all these sort of memories, and there's many more, all sorts of things. My son still says that he wished he had childline at the time for me forcing him to sit in all these little conspiratorial meetings in that room above City Road, planning the demonstrations and the disruptions. But it is a very valuable part of the political and social history of Wales, and I think really deserves photographically and in terms of interviews and data and the chronology going back as far as Hywel has mentioned, really does need to be properly put together.
Great, well, thank you all so much. That's been incredibly interesting. I'm going to hand back now to Ian to say a bit about Llafur, the Welsh People's Society, and to wrap up. But diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Morwenna. Well, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to extend our grateful thanks to Morwenna and to all our panelists, Hanef, Gaynor, Mick, Hywel and Mair, for offering us such powerful testimonies and memories into the political struggle of the anti-apartheid movement in Wales. Many thanks also to all of you, the audience, for your comments and questions via chat. Thanks to the people who organised the event today, Colin, James, Darren and Sean. Hanef mentioned the annual walk to commemorate the Soweto massacre to raise funds. The walk couldn't be held this year due to COVID-19. So Hanef has asked us to say that if anyone would like to make a contribution to the work of Action for South Africa, which raises awareness and funds for educational and health charities in South Africa, you can do so via their website, or there is a link on the Llafur Twitter page. Meanwhile, our next online event will be a fortnight today when Dr. Chris Evans, Marion Gwynn and Audrey West will be leading a session on the history of slavery in Wales. Full details will be posted soon on the Llafur website and our Twitter page, and will also be emailed out to all Llafur members. Whilst we're on the subject of membership, if there's anyone present today who is not yet a member of Llafur, I hope you'll consider joining. Details of how to subscribe can be found on our website. Thanks again, everyone, and see you all at the next event. Thank you.